I don't know what hurts worse. That you lied about your name for 6 weeks, or that you let me suffer for 2 extra days once you didn't have to.
Marcus Whitfield owned 9 resorts and had never once had to fix a broken faucet in his life, until the week he decided the only way to find a woman who'd love him for himself was to disappear into his own hotel wearing a maintenance badge and a different last name. He had $2 billion, a name that opened doors in cities he'd never visited, and not a single person in his life who'd ever looked at him without also seeing the number attached to his name. So he became someone else. Grey coveralls, a borrowed last name, a job scrubbing floors and fixing hinges at the very resort his own father had built from nothing, decades earlier. What he found there was a woman named Renee Alvarado, 11 years at the same front desk, raising a son largely on her own, driving out every single Sunday to check on a father who used to work the shrimp boats until his knees gave out. She never once asked where Marcus came from, what he did before this job, or why a maintenance man sometimes talked like he belonged in a boardroom. She simply treated him like he mattered, long before she had any reason to think he could ever pay her back for it. He didn't expect to find anyone in 6 weeks. He definitely didn't expect the first person he'd fall for to be the one woman his own company was quietly preparing to destroy, blamed for a scandal she never caused, punished for a warning she'd given in writing, twice, and been ignored both times. Marcus had built a plan to test whether love could survive without his money. What he never planned for was finding out exactly what it would cost him to stay silent 2 days too long. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Whitfield was 38 years old, and by every measure the outside world used to keep score, he had already won. 9 resorts along the southeast coast, a name that opened doors in cities he'd never even visited, a portfolio large enough that his own accountants sometimes had to remind him what he actually owned. But Marcus had learned something over the last 2 years that no business publication had ever prepared him for, and no amount of money had ever managed to fix. The thing he wanted most wasn't for sale, and having a great deal of money only seemed to make it harder to find. He had been engaged twice. The first time to a woman named Vivian, who cried real tears when he proposed to her on a private balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor, and didn't cry once, 3 weeks later, when she ended things the same week she learned his father intended to leave him controlling interest in the company, rather than splitting it evenly between Marcus and his sister. The second engagement lasted almost a year, longer than the first, mostly because Marcus had convinced himself that patience alone could turn something hollow into something real. It couldn't. By the time that relationship ended, in a lawyer's conference room discussing a prenuptial agreement neither party particularly wanted to sign, Marcus had stopped believing the problem was simply bad luck in choosing partners. He'd started believing the problem was structural. Nobody who met him ever really met him first. They met the name. Everything after that was a woman deciding what to do with the name, whether she loved it, resented it, or simply tolerated it in exchange for what came attached to it. His younger sister, Dana, had heard every version of this particular conversation, more times than either of them could count, usually late in the evening, usually in his office, on the top floor of Whitfield Coastal Resort's headquarters, with a view of the city lit up below them, like something out of a postcard nobody in that building ever had time to actually enjoy. Dana ran operations for the entire resort group, had done so since she was 29, and loved her brother enough to tell him uncomfortable truths, even when a softer lie would have been easier for both of them. "You keep dating women who fall in love with the idea of you," she told him one evening, setting down a glass of wine she'd barely touched. Vivian loved the version of you that existed in magazine profiles. Sabrina loved the version of you that came with a Range Rover and season tickets. You've never actually let anyone meet the version of you that fixes a leaking faucet with his own hands, instead of calling someone and writing a check. Marcus turned the thought over for the better part of 3 days before he brought it back to her, fully formed, in a way that told Dana immediately that he hadn't been merely venting the first time. He wanted to work the floor of one of their own properties. Not a tour, not a photo opportunity with a hard hat and a press release attached to it. A real job, with a fake name, with nobody aware of who he actually was except Dana herself, and whichever general manager she'd need to quietly loop in to make the paperwork clear a compliance review without raising alarm. I want to find out if there's a single person left in this company who'd care about me without knowing what I'm worth first, he said. And I can't find that answer sitting behind this desk for one more year. Dana studied her brother for a long moment, the way she'd studied him since they were children, and she could always tell the difference between Marcus complaining and Marcus deciding. This was clearly the second kind. She agreed to help him, mostly because she understood, from 30-some years of experience, that arguing with him at this stage only delayed an outcome that was already decided. She handled the paperwork herself, routing a temporary hire through a shell HR request that wouldn't raise questions from anyone below her own level, and she chose Whitfield Bayside specifically. It was far enough from headquarters that recognition wasn't a serious risk, and their father had opened that particular resort himself, decades earlier, back when the company was 3 modest properties and a mortgage instead of 9, and an empire that occasionally forgot where it had started. 2 weeks later, a man calling himself Marcus Cole filled out an employment application in the maintenance department of Whitfield Bayside. Same first name, because Dana had insisted, correctly, that a completely foreign identity would be harder to maintain under any real pressure than a familiar first name paired with an unfamiliar last one. Grey coveralls that fit nothing like the tailored suits Marcus had worn almost exclusively for the better part of a decade. A badge photo that looked, even to Marcus himself, like a stranger wearing his face. The general manager, a tightly wound man named Preston Yates, had been told only that corporate was placing a temporary maintenance hire as part of an internal operations review. Preston didn't ask many follow-up questions, mostly because questions directed at corporate rarely worked in his favor, and he assigned Marcus Cole to the general maintenance rotation without a second glance, the same way he assigned every other new hire, whose face he wouldn't bother learning until they'd been there at least 6 months. Marcus expected the physical work itself to be the hardest part of the disguise. He was wrong within the first 3 days. The hardest part was watching, at close range, exactly how his own company treated the people inside it when nobody wearing a name that mattered was in the room to see it happen. He noticed the small cruelties first, the kind that never make it into any corporate report, because no single instance of them is dramatic enough to justify writing one up. A junior housekeeper named Denise got publicly reprimanded in the hallway for a late checkout that wasn't remotely her fault, while the front desk associate, who'd actually caused the delay, stood 2 feet away and said nothing in her defense. A bellman who'd worked the property for 6 years got passed over for a shift lead position in favor of a general manager's nephew who'd been employed there less than 4 months. None of it rose to the level of scandal. All of it was the sort of slow, quiet unfairness that accumulates across a career, unnoticed by anyone except the person absorbing it, one small injustice at a time, year after year, until 11 years had somehow passed, and nobody above them had ever once stopped to ask if it was fair. And then there was Renee Alvarado. Marcus heard her name before he ever saw her face, mentioned by 2 housekeepers in the break room as the reason the front-of-house team hadn't fallen apart years earlier. "Ask for Renee," one of them said to the other, discussing a guest complaint neither of them wanted anywhere near their own name. "She's the only one who can talk an angry man down off a ledge without making him feel foolish for climbing up there in the first place." He met her properly on his 3rd day, called over to fix a jammed side door near the guest relations desk, while a wealthy guest loudly complained about a missed anniversary reservation upgrade. Marcus worked slowly on purpose, curious to watch how she'd handle a man who seemed determined to ruin someone's morning. Renee never raised her voice, not even slightly. She let the guest finish his entire complaint before she said a single word in response, and when she finally spoke, she offered him a complimentary sweet change and thanked him, with what sounded like genuine warmth rather than scripted apology, for his patience while she sorted the situation out properly. The man was laughing within 4 minutes. He left a 5-star review before he'd even reached the elevator bank. "Some people just need to feel heard before they'll feel helped," Renee said, mostly to herself, once the guest had walked away satisfied. She noticed Marcus still crouched by the door hinge, wrench in hand, clearly having taken far longer on the repair than the job required. Costs nothing to listen first. You'd be amazed how many people in this business skip straight past that part and wonder why nothing they say ever actually lands. You didn't even flinch when he raised his voice at you, Marcus said. She shrugged, like the observation wasn't worth much discussion. He's not really angry at me. He's angry about missing an anniversary dinner reservation because our booking system glitched on him. I just happened to be the one standing in front of him when all that frustration finally had somewhere to go. She glanced properly at his name tag for the first time, the way a person reads a name they intend to remember rather than simply glancing past it. You're new! Started this week, Marcus said. Well, Marcus. She said his name plainly, without any particular weight attached to it yet. Welcome to the deep end. Over the weeks that followed, Marcus found more reasons than his actual work orders justified to stay near the guest relations desk. He told himself it was research, that observing Renee handle the front of the house was the clearest window he had into how the company actually functioned once you stripped away the quarterly reports and the polished investor presentations. He believed that explanation for roughly 2 weeks. After that, he stopped pretending, even privately to himself, that research was the only thing drawing him there. He learned that Renee had worked at Whitfield Bayside for 11 years, longer than almost anyone on staff, apart from 2 members of the kitchen crew who'd been there since the property first opened. He learned she'd raised her son largely on her own since her divorce, a young man named Tyler who was finishing his 2nd year at the local community college and working weekends at a hardware store to help cover what his mother's paycheck alone couldn't quite stretch to reach. He learned her father had spent 40 years as a shrimper, working out of the Charleston docks before his knees finally gave out on him, and that she still drove out to see him every single Sunday without exception, rain or otherwise, because he lived alone now, and Sundays had always been the day they set aside for each other, long before either of them had any reason to think that tradition might someday matter more than it once had. He learned all of this slowly, across a string of overlapping lunch breaks that started by accident, in a break room too small for 2 people to eat entirely alone in without eventually speaking to one another. Renee talked. Marcus mostly listened, partly because listening was simpler than lying by omission, and partly because he had genuinely never met anyone who discussed hard things with so little self-pity woven through them. She told him about the years right after her divorce, when she'd worked doubles most weeks just to keep Tyler enrolled in the same school district he'd always known, because uprooting him to somewhere cheaper would have meant losing the one piece of stability he had left after watching his parents' marriage come apart in front of him. She told him about her father's stubbornness regarding doctors, the appointments he kept pushing back because he didn't want to be, in his own words, a burden on anybody, least of all the daughter who still saw, whenever she looked at him, the same man who used to let her ride along on the boat on Saturday mornings and pretend she was actually helping mend the nets, instead of just getting in the way. She never once asked Marcus where he was from before this job, what he'd done with his life up to this point, or why a maintenance technician occasionally used vocabulary that sounded more like a boardroom than a break room. She simply accepted the version of him sitting across the table from her, the way she seemed to accept most difficult things in her life. Completely, without conditions attached, without needing to interrogate the parts of the picture that didn't quite line up. You listen like someone who's used to not being heard, she told him one afternoon, mostly as a joke, though something underneath her voice suggested she meant it slightly more than the joke allowed for. Marcus laughed, surprised by how precisely that landed on something true. Maybe I am, he said, and left the sentence there, because the truth sitting beneath it was longer and considerably more complicated than either of them had 15 minutes of a lunch break to properly unpack. Around the same time, Marcus began noticing something else, something that troubled him far more than his own growing feelings for a woman he was actively lying to about his identity. Preston Yates had a pattern, and once Marcus started looking for it, he found it everywhere. Wins that clearly belonged to frontline staff somehow migrated into Preston's quarterly reports as his own strategic initiatives. Failures that traced directly back to management decisions somehow landed, in the official paper trail, on whichever employee happened to be easiest to blame at the time. Marcus still had back-end access to the resort's internal systems through his real corporate credentials, which he checked quietly most nights after his shift ended. Sitting alone in the small rented apartment, he'd taken a few miles from the property, specifically so no coworker would ever have a reason to see where Marcus Cole actually lived. He found, buried in an unremarkable email thread from 2 months before his own arrival, 2 separate warnings Renee had raised about the resort's loyalty rewards program. She had flagged, clearly and in writing, on 2 separate occasions, that the point tracking system appeared to be miscalculating balances for returning guests, sometimes shorting them by a significant margin. Preston had replied both times with a short, dismissive message, telling her the system was functioning correctly and that she should stop raising concerns outside her department's actual responsibilities. Marcus read those 2 emails 3 separate times before finally closing the laptop that night, unable to shake the growing feeling that he was looking directly at a fuse someone had already lit and simply hadn't gotten around to lighting the other end of yet. He didn't say anything to Renee about what he'd found. Not yet. Part of him reasoned that it wasn't his place, not as Marcus Cole, a maintenance technician with no actual standing, to fix a systems error occurring 6 pay grades above the one he was currently pretending to occupy. A quieter, more honest part of him understood that raising it at all would require explaining exactly how a maintenance hire had back-end access to internal corporate emails no maintenance hire should ever legitimately see, and he wasn't ready to have that particular conversation. Not with Renee. Not yet, and maybe, some nights, he privately admitted to himself, not ever, if he could somehow avoid it. Instead, he kept showing up. Their lunches continued overlapping, and slowly expanded past lunch, into short conversations near the loading dock at the end of a shift, into an unofficial habit of walking partway toward the employee parking lot together, most evenings, neither of them ever quite acknowledging out loud that the route Marcus took home didn't actually require passing anywhere near where Renee's car was parked. Weeks passed this way. Marcus learned that Renee kept a small photo of her father's shrimp boat taped inside her locker, faded now from years of humidity. He learned that Tyler was studying to become an electrician, not because it particularly excited him, but because Renee had told him, more than once, that a trade with your hands could never be outsourced or automated the way so many office jobs eventually were, and Tyler had taken the advice seriously, the way a son takes seriously the only parent who never once let him down. He learned that Renee kept a private list, in a small notebook she carried in her bag, of every guest complaint she'd successfully resolved over the years, not to brag about it to anyone, but because on hard days, she told him, it helped to remind herself that the job meant something, even when nobody above her seemed to notice. Marcus found himself telling her things too, though always carefully edited versions of the truth, close enough to honest that his conscience could tolerate it, distant enough from the whole truth that his secret stayed intact. He told her about a father who'd built something enormous and then spent so much time building it that his children sometimes felt like features of the business rather than people inside the family running it. He told her about 2 failed engagements, though he described them only as failed relationships, without mentioning the specific shape of what had actually gone wrong in each one. Renee listened the same way she listened to everyone, fully, without judgment, occasionally offering the kind of plain observation that landed harder than any therapist's careful phrasing ever could. Sounds to me like you've spent your whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from you, she told him once, after he'd finished a particularly guarded version of the Vivian story. That'll make a person forget what it feels like when somebody just wants to sit with you instead. Marcus didn't answer that one for a long moment. He simply nodded, because she had, without knowing it, described the entire reason he was sitting across from her in grey coveralls in the first place. 6 weeks into his time at Whitfield Bayside, Marcus had learned enough about the resort, enough about Preston, and enough about Renee to feel like the disguise had already accomplished exactly what he'd hoped it would when he first proposed the idea to Dana. He had found someone who cared about the man sitting across from her, not the name that would eventually be attached to him. What he hadn't accounted for, and what no amount of careful planning could have prepared him for, was how much harder that discovery would make everything that came next. The loyalty point error Renee had flagged twice, and been dismissed twice for flagging, finally exploded into a crisis nobody at the resort could quietly contain any longer. A long-time guest, a woman who had stayed at Whitfield Properties for well over a decade, discovered her own rewards balance had been quietly shorted by nearly 40% over the previous 18 months. She did the math herself, meticulously, and posted detailed screenshots online, along with a furious breakdown explaining exactly how the numbers didn't add up. The post spread faster than anyone at corporate communications could have anticipated, migrating within a single day from one angry guest's account to a small but growing wave of other long-time loyalty members checking their own balances and discovering the exact same discrepancy waiting for them. Corporate public relations moved into full crisis mode almost immediately, and crisis mode, Marcus had learned across years of actually running this company from the top rather than watching it from the floor, always asked the same first question before anything else got decided. Whose name goes on the apology? Preston needed an answer quickly, and he needed one that kept his own name as far from the center of the unfolding story as institutionally possible. Guest satisfaction and loyalty perception fell, on the org chart at least, under the guest relations department, Renee's department. Preston drafted an internal statement for corporate sign-off that framed the entire failure as Renee having neglected to properly escalate a known system issue, a claim that was, on its actual face, almost precisely the inverse of what had happened, since the written record clearly showed she had escalated the issue twice and been personally shut down both times by the very man now quietly building a case against her. Dana found the draft sitting in her inbox awaiting corporate approval and read it through twice before calling her brother, her voice tight with a fury she rarely allowed herself to show even in private. "There is a woman about to lose her job over something she personally tried to prevent," she said, before Marcus had even fully finished saying hello. "You need to see this email chain immediately." Marcus read it standing in his kitchen, still wearing the coveralls from his shift that day, and felt something shift hard in his chest that had nothing to do with the professional outrage he might normally reserve for a case of blatant corporate mismanagement, though there was certainly plenty of that too, layered underneath everything else. This was personal now, in a way he could no longer pretend to separate cleanly from the rest of it, and he knew that the moment his hands started shaking slightly around the phone in his own kitchen. He found Renee in the break room that evening, considerably later than her usual shift, staring down at her phone with a stillness that worried him far more than tears would have. "Preston called me in this afternoon," she said, without looking up right away when he sat down across from her. "They're building a termination case. Failure to escalate a known issue, they're calling it. 11 years, Marcus. 11 years, and they're ending it over the exact thing I put in writing that I was worried about, 2 separate times, months before any of this ever became a real problem." Marcus sat down across from her, every instinct in his body pulling hard toward his phone, toward one single call to legal that could end this entire situation within the hour. But making that call meant explaining, in full, exactly who he actually was, and some part of him, some part he was not proud of even as it happened in real time, hesitated at the very edge of that particular cliff. "They can't fire you for something you personally tried to stop," he said instead, choosing the smaller true thing over the larger true thing he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. "Do you still have the original emails? The ones where you flagged it the first time?" "I have all of it," Renee said. "It won't matter though. Preston runs this building. Whoever sits above him has never once heard my name mentioned for anything, good or bad, in 11 years of working here." That last sentence stayed with Marcus long after she went home that night, playing itself on a loop he couldn't quiet no matter how he tried, because he knew, with complete and uncomfortable certainty, that it wasn't actually true anymore. Somebody sitting above Preston did know her name, had known it for 6 weeks now, had eaten lunch across from her nearly every single day during that time. For 2 full days, Marcus wrestled with a decision that should have taken him no more than 10 minutes to make. Every instinct belonging to Marcus Cole told him to stay quiet a little longer, to let the disguise finish running its course naturally, to protect the fragile, genuinely real thing he had found here before subjecting it to a truth that might destroy it instantly. Every instinct belonging to Marcus Whitfield told him, with increasing urgency, that a woman he had clearly come to care about a great deal was about to lose 11 years of her working life over a mistake that belonged entirely to someone else, and that every additional hour he spent protecting his own comfort was an hour stolen directly from hers, at a cost she hadn't agreed to and didn't deserve to pay. On the morning of the third day, he finally stopped wrestling with it. He didn't schedule a meeting through proper channels. He didn't loop in Dana first, or legal, or any of the safer procedural paths that would have protected the version of himself he'd carefully built inside that building over the previous 6 weeks. He walked directly into Preston's office, still dressed in his grey coveralls from that morning's shift, and set his personal phone down on the desk, open to an email that had gone out 3 years earlier to only Dana and outside legal counsel. The signature line reading, "In full, Marcus Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer, Whitfield Coastal Resorts." Preston's face moved through 3 distinct stages before he managed to say anything at all. Confusion first, then disbelief, and finally something that resembled genuine physical illness as the full weight of the situation arrived all at once, crashing down on him in the space of about 4 seconds. "You are going to call corporate right now," Marcus said, his voice noticeably quieter than he expected it to come out. "And you are going to tell them the termination case against Renee Alvarado is withdrawn effective immediately, pending a full internal review, which I will personally be overseeing starting tonight." Preston's hands shook visibly as he reached for the phone on his desk. By midnight, the entire situation had unraveled, though only within the small circle of people who needed to know it immediately. The full email chain was pulled and reviewed, line by line. The timeline was undeniable to anyone looking at it honestly. Preston had ignored 2 direct written warnings from Renee, then attempted to make her the sole point of failure for a systemic problem he had personally dismissed both times it was properly raised to him. Marcus ended the call to corporate that night with a single clear directive. Preston's employment was terminated, effective immediately and with cause, and Renee's personnel record would be cleared entirely, in writing, distributed company-wide within the following week. He should have felt some measure of relief once that call finally ended. Instead, he felt a dread heavier than anything the previous 6 weeks had prepared him to carry, because there remained only one conversation left to have now, and it was the exact conversation he had built an entire elaborate disguise specifically to avoid having under these particular terms. He asked Renee to meet him the next morning, before her shift began, in the same small break room where she'd told him, only 2 days earlier, that she had 11 years of service and nothing left to show for it if this situation went the way she genuinely feared it might. She walked in already smiling, a version of relief written plainly across her whole face that made everything about to happen next almost unbearable to watch unfold in real time. "I heard the case got dropped," she said, sitting down across from him. "I don't even know how exactly, but somebody upstairs must have finally looked at the actual—" She stopped mid-sentence, because Marcus wasn't smiling back at her, and because he was standing there dressed in a suit she had genuinely never once seen him wear in 6 weeks, his entire posture different from the man who fixed jammed doors and ate lunch across from her 15 unhurried minutes at a time. "Renee, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get all the way through it before you say anything back to me." Her smile faded slowly, replaced by a wariness that hurt considerably more to watch settle in than anger would have. "Marcus, what is going on right now?" "My name is Marcus Whitfield," he said, as plainly as he could manage. "I own this resort. I own all 9 of them." He watched her expression move through disbelief, then rapid mental calculation, then finally settle into something he recognized instantly as betrayal finding its proper footing. "I came here undercover because I genuinely wanted to find someone who could care about me without knowing any of that information first. And I found her. I found you. But when I learned exactly what Preston was doing to you, I had the power to stop it the very moment I found out about it. And instead, I let 2 more full days pass while you sat there terrified, because I wasn't ready yet to stop being Marcus Cole. That's the part I most need you to understand isn't an excuse I'm offering you. It's simply the truth of what happened." Renee stayed quiet for long enough that the silence itself became its own complete answer. When she finally did speak, her voice carried none of the volume the moment might have seemed to call for, which somehow made every word land harder than shouting ever could have. "You watched me nearly lose 11 years of my life," she said slowly. "You had the power to stop that the second you found out what was happening, and you let me sit at home terrified for 2 extra days, because you weren't ready to stop pretending to be somebody else." "Yes," Marcus said, because there was no version of this particular conversation where a softer answer would have also been an honest one. "I don't know what actually hurts worse," Renee said, "that you lied about your name for 6 entire weeks, or that you let me suffer for 2 more days once you didn't have any reason left to." She stood up, gathered the small bag she'd set down when she'd first walked in, still smiling, and left the break room without saying another word, first out into the hallway, then out through the loading entrance she used every single morning, into a parking lot. Marcus watched her cross through the small window, without moving from where he stood, rooted in place. He didn't follow her out. Some part of him understood, clearly and immediately, that chasing her down in that moment would only prove the exact thing she now firmly believed about him, that he still assumed a problem this large could be solved with precisely the right words, delivered at precisely the right moment, the way problems had always, quietly and effortlessly, solved themselves for him before. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of Marcus's entire adult life, and remarkably little of that difficulty had anything to do with corporate strategy or crisis management. He terminated Preston formally, with documented cause, and made certain the man's severance agreement carried no confidentiality clause, protecting his professional reputation going forward, since Marcus had no interest whatsoever in letting the story quietly disappear behind an NDA the way these situations so often did at companies less willing to sit with their own discomfort. He personally rebuilt the resort's entire loyalty rewards audit process from the ground up, adding a second independent layer of review specifically so no single manager could ever again bury a legitimate warning without a permanent paper trail surviving the attempt. He went considerably further than that particular fix strictly required. He instituted a company-wide anonymous escalation line across all 9 properties, one that reported directly to corporate legal instead of routing through any general manager's office, precisely so the next Renee Alvarado at the next resort would never again have to say the words, "Whoever sits above him has never once heard my name." He personally reviewed every internal complaint filed at Whitfield Bayside over the preceding 3 years, a task that consumed most of his evenings for the better part of a month, and uncovered 4 additional instances of managers deflecting blame onto staff who had done nothing whatsoever to deserve it. Each case was corrected individually, publicly acknowledged within the company, with back pay and formal written apologies issued to employees, some of whom had already left the company years earlier, having long since given up any real hope that anyone would ever come back to make it right. He didn't call Renee during any of this. He didn't send flowers or a letter or arrange to run into her somewhere that would look accidental but wasn't. He understood now, with a clarity that had taken him 38 years and 1 devastating morning to finally reach, that an apology without meaningfully changed behavior behind it was simply a nicer-sounding lie, and he had already told her more than enough of those to last a lifetime she hadn't asked to spend around him. 2 months passed before Renee finally reached out first. She didn't go through Marcus Cole, who no longer existed on any employment roster anywhere in the system, and she didn't go through the executive assistant, who now handled Marcus Whitfield's calendar for him. She called Dana directly, having found her direct line through the corporate directory, and asked for a meeting with whichever version of Marcus was actually real, because she said, plainly, that she genuinely wasn't certain anymore which one that even was. They met in the same break room, though it had been quietly renovated in the time since. New paint, considerably better lighting, and a small plaque mounted near the door listing the resort's newly implemented employee protections, dated the week immediately following Preston's termination. "I read about all the changes," Renee said, sitting down across from him for the first time in 2 full months. "The audit process, the escalation line, the other people you found and made things right for, some of whom had already left and probably never expected a single person to come back for them after all this time. I wasn't sure at first whether any of that was really you behind it, or whether it was just very good public relations dressed up carefully to look like conscience. It's not particularly good public relations if almost nobody outside legal even knows I personally did most of it, Marcus said. I didn't make any of those changes to win you back, Renee. I made them because they genuinely needed doing, and I finally ran out of excuses left to keep avoiding them. Renee studied him for a long moment before speaking again, the same careful, unhurried way she used to study an angry guest, before deciding exactly how best to bring them back down from wherever their frustration had taken them. I still don't fully know how I feel about the timeline, she admitted. 6 weeks of not knowing who you actually were, then 2 more full days of you knowing exactly who you were, and still choosing not to tell me, while I sat at home, genuinely convinced I was about to lose everything I'd spent 11 years building. You don't have to decide any of that today, Marcus said. I'm not asking you to. I'm only asking whether there's a version of this where you'd let me prove something to you over real time, the same patient way I'd have wanted you to prove yourself to me, if the situation had somehow happened in reverse. It took the better part of a full year for that proving to actually mean something real to her. It started small, the way most honest things eventually do. Dinners that began as nothing more than 2 people carefully catching up on a friendship that had been interrupted rather than fully ended. Marcus showing up, entirely unasked, to Tyler's graduation ceremony from community college, because Renee had mentioned the exact date once, in passing, months earlier, and Marcus had simply remembered it the way people remember the things that genuinely matter to them without needing to write it down. Renee, slowly and carefully, meeting Dana, and eventually the small circle of people who had actually known Marcus long before the company itself ever knew his name, watching closely how they spoke about him whenever he stepped out of the room, which told her, over time, considerably more than anything he could have simply told her directly to her face. She watched him decline, more than once, genuine opportunities to publicize the sweeping changes he'd made across the entire company, opportunities that would have made him look remarkably generous and forward-thinking in exactly the kind of press cycle most executives in his position would have eagerly chased down themselves. He turned every one of them down, quietly, without ever mentioning to her that he'd done it, until she happened to find out, entirely by accident, through an unrelated conversation with someone in corporate communications, who mentioned, almost as a passing aside, how strange it seemed that the CEO kept refusing interview requests about his own policy reforms. Somewhere in the middle of that year, on an ordinary Sunday drive out to visit her father at his small house near the water, Renee found herself telling Marcus, almost without deciding to say it out loud first, that her father had finally agreed to see a doctor about his knees after years of putting it off, and that some part of her credited the change to watching how consistently Marcus had shown up, week after week, without ever once making a show of it. He said, "If a man like you could take the trouble to keep showing up for somebody else's family, that many times without asking for a thing in return," she said, then he figured he could at least go sit in a waiting room for an hour. Marcus didn't say much in response. He simply reached over and took her hand for a moment, the two of them driving in comfortable silence the rest of the way, and something in that silence told them both, without either one needing to say it aloud yet, that whatever this was had already become something worth protecting properly this time. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Preston's termination case against her had been formally closed for good, Marcus asked Renee to meet him once more in the break room at Whitfield Bayside, the same room where nearly everything between them had first taken root, then broken apart entirely, then slowly, carefully, patiently begun rebuilding itself from the ground up. The plaque by the door carried a new line beneath the original list of employee protections, one Renee hadn't seen before that particular morning. It read simply that the policy existed in memory of every employee who had ever been unfairly blamed for someone else's mistake, and that the company saw them clearly now. Marcus didn't propose with a crowd gathered around them, or a photographer waiting outside, or any of the elaborate performance his family's name might have made effortlessly available to him without a second thought. He did it exactly the way Renee Alvarado had handled every difficult moment throughout her 11 years of service. Quietly, directly, without needing an audience present to make any of it feel real. "I'm not asking you to marry a billionaire," he told her, holding both her hands in his. "I already know that was never what you actually wanted, and it never will be. I'm asking you to marry the man who finally learned, because of you, and because of what nearly happened to you, exactly what it costs to tell the truth on time, instead of whenever it eventually becomes convenient to tell it." Renee looked over at the plaque by the door for a long moment before turning her gaze back to him. "Ask me properly then," she said, something warm finally breaking through in her voice. He did. She said yes, without a single moment of hesitation, standing in a break room that had once very nearly cost her everything she'd built, and had somehow, instead, quietly become the exact place where everything that actually mattered to her had finally, truly begun. Whitfield Bayside operates today with a guest relations department that has reported no confirmed cases of managerial retaliation in company records since the policy changes first went into effect, a fact Renee, now Vice President of Guest Experience across all 9 Whitfield properties, mentions to every new hire during their very first week of onboarding. She doesn't mention it because of the title it eventually earned her, though the title matters plenty to the son she raised largely on her own, who still calls her every single Sunday now, the same day she still drives out to see her father, whose knees, after the surgery, finally let him walk the length of the dock again without pain. She mentions it because of what almost happened to her once, in a break room that has better lighting now than it used to, before somebody finally learned, at real and lasting cost to himself, exactly what it means to tell the truth in time, instead of simply waiting until the truth becomes convenient enough to finally tell.